I am Chloe, 32 years old, and a luxury real estate developer. Until last Sunday, my mother demanded I cancel my October wedding because my entitled sister was more important than me. She slid a check across the table and told me to just go to the courthouse so my sister could take my venue. I simply slid the check back and smiled. I had no idea that within weeks they would realize I was done begging for a seat at my own life, and the meltdown that followed would be absolutely pathetic and perfect. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who tried to strip you of your joy. Growing up in Atlanta, Sunday dinners at my mother Brenda's house were a rigid institution. The smell of baked macaroni and cheese-collared greens and smothered chicken usually meant comfort, but in our household it was a stage for my mother to showcase her favorite child. My younger sister Maya was exactly 30 years old and had spent 3 decades mastering the art of the golden child. While I spent my 20s building a real estate portfolio from the ground up, Maya floated from one aesthetic job to another, always funded by the Bank of Mom. The dynamic was exhausting, but I tolerated it for the sake of peace. That peace shattered completely on a warm Sunday evening. The dining room was packed with extended family. Old-school R&B music played softly from the living room speakers. Julian, my fiancé, sat beside me. He is a venture capitalist, sharp-grounded, and the only man who ever matched my ambition without being intimidated by it. Across from us sat Maya, practically draped over her new fiancé, Connor. Connor was 32, a privileged white man from a family that constantly bragged about their old money connections. He had a habit of speaking to my family like he was studying a different species, an arrogance wrapped in polite smiles. Maya spent the first half of dinner flashing a massive diamond ring in everyone's face, loudly complaining about how stressful it was to find a venue that met the standards of Connor's high society parents. I minded my business, quietly enjoying my meal and chatting with Julian about our own wedding plans for October. Then my mother picked up a silver spoon and clinked it against her crystal wine glass. The chatter around the large mahogany table died down. Brenda stood up at the head of the table, smoothing down her dress with a bright, performative smile. She thanked everyone for coming, talked about how blessed the family was, and then turned her gaze directly to me. Her smile did not reach her eyes. She announced to the entire room that she had some wonderful news regarding the wedding schedules. She said that since Maya and Connor needed a venue immediately to accommodate his parents' elite country club friends, Chloe and Julian had graciously decided to postpone their October wedding so Maya could take the date. The room went completely silent. You could hear a pin drop. Julian stiffened beside me, his hand immediately covering mine under the table. I did not scream. I did not cry. I slowly wiped my mouth with my napkin and looked at my mother. I asked her exactly what she was talking about, since Julian and I had absolutely no plans to postpone our wedding. Brenda let out a high-pitched, dismissive laugh, waving her hand as if I had just told a silly joke. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and slid it across the mahogany table. It stopped right next to my plate. It was a check for $5,000. Maya is marrying into high society, Brenda said, her tone dripping with condescension. You and Julian can just go to the courthouse. It is not like your guest list is full of important corporate connections anyway. Take the money to cover your little venue deposit, and do not be selfish for once in your life, Chloe. Your sister needs this. I looked down at the check, then up at Maya. My sister was pouting her lips, playing the fragile victim perfectly. She whined that she simply had to have a fall wedding, and that it was unfair for me to hold on to a date when I was already so successful in business. She claimed I should want to share my blessings. I calmly placed my index finger on the check and slid it right back across the table to Brenda. I told them my wedding date was not up for negotiation and my venue was certainly not available for transfer. That is when Connor decided to step in. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, giving me a look of pity that made my blood boil. Listen, Chloe, he said, using that slow, patient voice people use when speaking to a child. Maya really needs this date. We know you put down a cute little deposit somewhere. $5,000 is more than generous to cover your losses. My parents have people flying in from the Hamptons. They expect a certain level of class and luxury that your sister just has an eye for. We can even write you another check for your troubles if money is the issue here." Julian let out a low, deep chuckle. It was a dark, amused sound that immediately wiped the smug smile off Connor's face. Julian leaned back in his chair, looking at Connor with absolute indifference. He told Connor to keep his checkbook closed before he embarrassed himself further. Brenda slammed her hands on the table. She raised her voice, demanding that Julian stay out of family business. She pointed a finger at me, her face contorted with anger. She yelled that I had always been jealous of Maya, that I was a difficult, stubborn woman who could never just be happy for her sister. She told me that if I did not hand over the venue contract by tomorrow morning, she would make sure none of the extended family attended my courthouse wedding. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my dress. I did not raise my voice or lose my temper. The days of letting my mother's harsh words dictate my emotions were long gone. I looked at Brenda, then at Maya, and finally at Connor. I told them to keep their $5,000 because they were going to need every penny of it to find a new location. As Julian and I turned to leave, Brenda hissed a promise to ruin my wedding day. She swore she would call every vendor in the city to shut me down. I simply smiled at her over my shoulder and walked out the front door. As we got into Julian's car, I let out a quiet laugh. They thought I had just put down a cute little deposit on a rental hall. They had absolutely no idea that my October wedding was taking place at the Sterling Estate, an exclusive $150,000 luxury property. And more importantly, they had no idea that my real estate holding company was the sole legal owner of the entire estate. Let them try to cancel that. My phone started vibrating across the marble kitchen island, exactly at 6 in the morning. Julian was standing at the stove pouring us coffee before his early venture capital meetings, but he paused when the screen lit up with a dozen rapid-fire notifications. I did not even have to look at the caller ID to know the storm had officially made landfall. I picked up the device and saw missed calls from Antoine, my exclusive floral designer, and Chef Marcel, the celebrity caterer I had secured a year in advance. They were not just calling, they were leaving frantic voicemails. I tapped the screen and put Antoine on speakerphone. His voice echoed through the pristine kitchen laced with pure panic. "Chloe, darling, I need you to call me back immediately. A woman claiming to be your mother just called my personal cell. She said you experienced a sudden financial crisis and are generously transferring your entire $50,000 floral deposit to your sister Maya. She demanded we immediately alter the design palette from your custom emerald and gold to blush pink because her future son-in-law Connor comes from a traditional family who finds jewel tones too aggressive. Please tell me this is a prank." Julian handed me my coffee mug and leaned against the counter, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. Before the voicemail even finished, Chef Marcel sent a text message in all capital letters, stating Brenda had just emailed his team, demanding a menu overhaul. She wanted to scrap our curated fusion menu in favor of bland country club chicken and roasted potatoes, claiming Julian and I were stepping down to have a quiet courthouse ceremony. My mother actually thought I was going to fold. She assumed that because I had spent the first 2 decades of my life keeping the peace, I would quietly surrender the most important day of my life to her golden child. She thought the little girl who used to shrink under her withering criticism was still alive and well. I took a slow sip of my dark roast coffee. I did not cry. I did not throw my mug against the wall or scream about the injustice of it all. Working in commercial real estate development teaches you very quickly how to handle hostile takeovers. You do not react with emotion. You respond with ironclad strategy. I sat down at my laptop, opened my secure email server, and initiated a conference call with Antoine and Chef Marcel simultaneously. When they answered, they were both speaking a mile a minute, apologizing for the early intrusion and asking if my financial portfolio had truly collapsed overnight. I cut them off with a calm, steady tone. I assured them that my finances were perfectly intact and that my wedding was moving forward exactly as planned. Then I explained the new protocol. I told them that my mother and my sister were attempting a highly coordinated hijacking of my venue and vendor contracts. I instructed both Antoine and Chef Marcel to immediately place a password protection lock on all my accounts. From this moment forward, any phone call, email, or carrier pigeon requesting a change to my event required a highly specific verbal passphrase. Without it, they were to deny all requests. But I did not stop there. I am not in the business of just blocking a punch. I believe in letting my opponents swing so wildly they knock themselves off balance. I instructed both of my vendors to play along with Brenda. I told Antoine to send my mother a highly official-looking email confirming that the floral transfer request had been received and was pending final venue authorization. I told Chef Marcel to assure Brenda that the bland chicken requested by Connor's family was noted in the preliminary file. I wanted Brenda and Maya to feel the absolute thrill of victory. I wanted them to plan, print, and pay for things under the absolute delusion that they had successfully bullied me into submission. Julian smiled, watching me type out the legal addendums to my vendor contracts. He kissed the top of my head and told me I was entirely too dangerous for my own good, before grabbing his briefcase and heading out the door. No sooner had the door clicked shut than my phone buzzed again. This time, a bright picture of Auntie Vivian flashed on the screen. Vivian is my father's older sister, and the only woman in my entire extended family who never bought into Brenda's toxic matriarch routine. She had always been my fierce protector, the one who saw my potential when my own mother treated my ambition like a character flaw. I answered the phone, and Auntie Vivian did not even bother saying good morning. She launched right into the chaos. "Niece, my phone has been ringing off the damn hook since we left that dining room last night. Your mother has lost her entire mind." I leaned back in my chair and asked her what the neighborhood gossip was currently broadcasting. Vivian let out a sharp laugh that rattled the speaker. "She is calling every auntie, cousin, and church member in Fulton County. She is standing by the choir loft, telling Deacon Thomas and anybody else who will listen that Connor is a tech startup genius, and that you were just so overwhelmed by the stress of planning a large wedding that you begged Maya to take your date. She is telling people you realized you could not afford the aesthetic Connor's wealthy family expects." The absolute audacity of the lie was breathtaking but completely on brand. I reminded Auntie Vivian that Brenda had been pulling this exact stunt since I was a teenager. Vivian hummed in agreement, her voice dropping an octave as she brought up the past. "Do not I know it? It is the exact same nonsense she pulled when you secured your first major commercial real estate deal. Do you remember that, Chloe? You closed a $3 million acquisition and wanted to celebrate at that nice steakhouse. But Maya had just bombed her third job interview that same week. Your mother hijacked your entire celebration dinner, crying at the table, saying you were rubbing your success in your sister's face. Then she guilt-tripped you into co-signing a luxury car loan for Maya, because she claimed Maya needed to look presentable to get hired. You ended up paying that car note for 2 years while Maya drove around acting like she was a CEO. I told you then to cut the cord with these people." I assured Auntie Vivian that the cord was not just cut, but entirely incinerated. I explained my morning vendor strategy, letting her know that Brenda was currently walking straight into a legal and financial trap of her own making. Vivian let out a long hum of approval, praising my business mindset, but then her tone shifted drastically. She lowered her voice, sounding suddenly urgent and serious. "Well, you better tighten that trap quickly, Chloe, because they are not just coming for your flowers and your chicken. I am driving down Peachtree right now, and I just saw something that made me pull my car over." I sat up straight, asking her what she saw. "I just watched your mother and Maya walk out of Maison de Luxe," Vivian said. My blood instantly ran cold. Maison de Luxe was not just any bridal shop. It was the ultra-exclusive invite-only bridal boutique where my custom wedding gown was currently in the final stages of production. The designer was a close personal contact of mine, and the dress was a one-of-a-kind masterpiece that I had spent months perfecting. Vivian continued, her voice laced with warning. They were walking out of those double doors holding a garment bag that looked thick enough to hold a ball gown. Maya had a smile on her face so wide, she looked like the cat that caught the canary. "You better call your designer right now because I think your mother just stole your dress." I thanked Auntie Vivian and ended the call. I sat in the silence of my kitchen, staring at the blank screen of my phone. Brenda and Maya actually thought they could waltz into a secure boutique and walk out with a bespoke gown meant for me. They wanted to wear my success, claim my date, eat my food, and now walk down the aisle in my clothes. The venue was clearly not enough for them. They wanted to strip me of everything. I gripped the edge of the marble counter, feeling a dangerous calm wash over me as I realized exactly what my next move had to be. The drive to Maison de Luxe was a blur of calculating thoughts and suppressed rage. The tires of my car screeched slightly as I pulled into the private parking garage beneath the luxury boutique. I did not bother waiting for the valet to open my door. I tossed my keys to the attendant and strode directly to the private elevator. My mind was moving a mile a minute, but my heart felt like a solid block of ice. This specific boutique was supposed to be my personal sanctuary. I had spent 6 exhaustive months collaborating with the head designer, poring over imported silk swatches and intricate hand-sewn lace patterns to create a gown that was uniquely mine. It was a masterpiece meant to reflect the life Julian and I were building together. I stepped out of the elevator into the plush, rose-scented lobby. The receptionist was a young woman who usually greeted me by name with a fresh glass of imported champagne. Today she suddenly looked like a deer caught in headlights. She stammered heavily, reaching for her desk phone with trembling fingers, telling me that the VIP suite was currently occupied for a private event, and I absolutely could not go back there. I ignored her entirely, walking right past the reception desk. I did not need directions because I could already hear it. Maya's high-pitched, theatrical laughter echoed down the marble hallway, cutting through the sophisticated quiet of the boutique like a jagged knife. I pushed open the heavy frosted glass doors of the VIP suite without knocking. The massive room was bathed in soft golden light and surrounded by flawless floor-to-ceiling mirrors. Right in the center, standing tall on the velvet pedestal, was my sister. She was wearing my dress. It was not a similar dress or a cheap copy. It was the exact custom gown I had designed down to the last pearl. The hand-beaded bodice that took highly trained artisans 3 full weeks to construct fit her snugly. The heavy silk skirt pooled around her feet like liquid glass, reflecting the expensive chandelier above. My mother, Brenda, was standing next to the pedestal, casually sipping champagne and fluffing the delicate train of my dress. For a fraction of a second, time simply stood still. They both turned to look at me standing in the doorway. I fully expected them to look guilty or at least caught off guard by my sudden arrival. Instead, Brenda smiled at me. It was that same predatory, triumphant smile she wore when she slid that insulting $5,000 check across the dining room table on Sunday. The head designer rushed forward from the corner of the room, her face flushed with absolute panic and regret. She clasped her hands together nervously, rambling about how my mother had called her first thing this morning with an emergency request. She explained that Brenda had paid double my original deposit as an expedite fee, claiming that I had graciously stepped aside for the good of the family. The designer stuttered, looking frantically between me and Brenda, saying she was explicitly told I had canceled my wedding entirely to let my sister take over the aesthetic. She said Brenda assured her that Connor's family demanded couture and that I was happy to surrender my custom order to keep the peace. Brenda confidently stepped in front of the designer, shielding Maya from my gaze. She looked me up and down with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. "Let us be honest," Chloe, Brenda said, taking a slow, arrogant sip of her champagne. "Maya just has the natural figure for this kind of silhouette. You have always carried your weight differently, and a dress this delicate would just look strained and awkward on you. We are doing you a favor by saving you the embarrassment." Besides, Connor's parents are old money, and they are accustomed to high fashion and true luxury. Julian will not know the difference if you walk down the aisle in a nice off-the-rack pantsuit. You two are practically married to your jobs anyway, so a courthouse ceremony makes the most sense for your lifestyle. I looked past my mother, refusing to engage with her desperate attempts to bait me. I focused entirely on Maya. My sister was smirking at her reflection in the tall mirrors, turning slightly from side to side to admire the intricate beadwork. She was waiting for the explosion, She wanted me to scream at the top of my lungs. She wanted me to cry and demand she take the dress off so she could play the fragile victim. She wanted to run back to our extended family and talk about how unstable and deeply jealous I was of her new high society life. She wanted a massive scene. She desperately needed me to be the angry, bitter sister to validate her own fragile ego and secure her position as the family favorite. This was exactly how Brenda and Maya operated. They pushed and provoked until you finally broke, and then they publicly blamed you for the resulting mess. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cold, clinical precision of my corporate real estate training take over completely. In business, you never let your opponent see you sweat, and you certainly never let them dictate the terms of the negotiation. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or show even a fraction of the rage burning inside my chest. I simply tilted my head and studied her on the pedestal with total indifference. I told Maya the dress looked exactly as it should on her. I told her the bodice was a bit tight, but considering she was accustomed to forcing herself into spaces where she did not belong, it was actually a perfect fit for her character. The arrogant smirk on Maya's face completely vanished, replaced by a look of sheer confusion. Brenda opened her mouth to snap at me, but I raised a single, authoritative finger, silencing her instantly. I turned to the designer, who was practically shaking with fear over a potential lawsuit, and told her to transfer the final remaining balance of the dress to my mother's credit card immediately. I added a strict, legally binding instruction that no further alterations were to be made on my dime, and that any future appointments regarding that specific gown were absolutely no longer my concern. I looked back at Maya, who was now shifting uncomfortably on the velvet pedestal, clearly disappointed that she was not getting the dramatic fight she so desperately craved. "You can keep it." "Maya," I said, my voice smooth and utterly dismissive. "It is a beautiful gown, but honestly, settling for someone else's leftovers suits your entire aesthetic perfectly. Enjoy your stolen wedding dress because it is the only genuine thing about your upcoming marriage." I turned around and walked out of the VIP suite without looking back. The silence I left behind was absolute and deafening. I could feel the heavy deflation in the room pressing against my back as I walked down the hall. By refusing to fight for the dress, I had instantly stripped it of its value to them. It was no longer a glittering prize because I no longer wanted it. The custom gown was now just a pathetic symbol of their desperate need to take what belonged to me. As I walked back through the quiet lobby and stepped into the private elevator, I pulled out my phone. I dialed a number I had been saving in my contacts for a very special occasion. It belonged to an ultra-exclusive invite-only bridal designer based in New York City. She was a brilliant, independent Black woman whose elite clientele consisted entirely of royalty-wealthy philanthropists and A-list celebrities. You did not just book an appointment with her boutique. You had to be heavily vetted and personally recommended by a former client. Luckily, she was a major financial investor in one of my recent commercial real estate developments, and we had become incredibly close friends. When she answered the phone, I told her I had a slight change of plans regarding my wedding wardrobe. I told her I needed a custom masterpiece designed and delivered in less than 2 weeks, and that my budget for the project was completely unlimited. She laughed a rich, warm sound, told me she loved an impossible challenge, and promised to fly down to Atlanta for a private fitting at my penthouse by tomorrow morning. I pushed through the boutique doors and stepped out into the bright afternoon sun. I felt incredibly light and unburdened. Brenda and Maya actually thought they were dismantling my wedding piece by piece, but they were actually just clearing out the clutter in my life. They were making ample room for exactly what I deserved, while simultaneously exposing their own toxic desperation. I walked across the concrete parking garage and slid into the driver's seat of my luxury sedan, feeling a renewed sense of absolute focus. Just as I hit the push to start ignition, a sharp notification pinged on my dashboard display screen. It was a secure encrypted email from Marcus, the elite private investigator I kept on heavy retainer for thorough corporate background checks. I had explicitly asked him to look into Connor and his supposedly massive tech wealth immediately after that disastrous Sunday dinner. The subject line of the message read simply, Connor Sterling, background report, urgent. I grabbed my phone from the center console and quickly opened the attached PDF file. I fully expected to find maybe a few inflated financial claims or some minor credit issues typical of guys who brag too much about their untouchable family trust funds. I slowly scrolled past the executive summary, and my eyes landed directly on the first page of his official financial disclosures. My breath caught sharply in my throat. I read the detailed figures twice, just to be absolutely certain I was comprehending the raw financial data correctly. The numbers on the screen told a story of absolute ruin. I dropped my phone onto the leather passenger seat and let out a loud gasp of sheer disbelief. Connor was not just exaggerating his family wealth or hiding a few bad investments. He was actively concealing a secret so massive and so legally catastrophic that it was going to blow my mother's high society dreams straight to pieces. Maya was not marrying into a life of luxury and old money prestige. She was walking blindly into a complete disaster, and I suddenly held the match that could burn their entire charade to the ground. The heavy sweet scent of hickory smoke, slow-roasted brisket, and tangy barbecue sauce hit me before I even stepped out of Julian's car. Auntie Vivian's annual Juneteenth cookout was legendary in our Atlanta neighborhood. It was the one day of the year where the entire community, from the deacons at our church to the kids who played basketball down the street, gathered in her sprawling, beautifully manicured backyard. Upbeat rhythm and blues music thumped a steady, joyful bass line against the humid summer air. Normally, this was my absolute favorite place on earth. It was my sanctuary, a place where I could shed the heavy, ruthless armor of my corporate life and simply be Chloe. But today, the air felt thick with something far more suffocating than the Georgia heat. As Julian and I walked through the side gate hand in hand, the joyous atmosphere was sharply punctured by a very specific, familiar kind of tension. I could feel the eyes of my extended relatives darting toward us, their faces tight with a mixture of pity and uncomfortable curiosity. I smoothed down my linen sundress, took a deep breath, and scanned the massive yard. I had barely crossed the freshly cut lawn when I spotted the circus. My mother Brenda and my sister Maya were holding court under the large oak tree near the patio, treating my aunt's home like their own personal red carpet event. They were not mingling to catch up on family news or celebrate the holiday. They were actively campaigning. Brenda was dressed in a completely over-the-top silk caftan that caught the afternoon breeze, making her look larger than life. She was holding a thick stack of square, glittering envelopes against her chest. Maya stood right beside her, practically glowing in a white designer sundress that was clearly chosen to mimic the custom bridal gown she had hijacked from my designer just days ago. She was giggling loudly at a joke someone had just made, playing the role of the blushing bride to absolute perfection. As Julian and I walked closer, I watched my mother hand one of those heavy envelopes to Mrs. Higgins, the sweet elderly woman who had lived next door to us since I was 7 years old. I did not need to guess what was inside. I walked straight up to Mrs. Higgins, gave her a warm, respectful hug, and gently slid the unsealed envelope from her frail hands under the guise of admiring it. The cardstock was impossibly thick, the kind that costs an absolute fortune to source and print on such short notice. It was a glossy, gold-foiled save-the-date card. The cursive font was elegant, swirling and dripping with old money pretension. I read the text, and my pulse immediately steadied into a cold, rhythmic, and highly dangerous beat. There, printed in bold, embossed gold letters, was my exact wedding date, October 14th, and right below it, listed with absolute blinding arrogance, was the venue, the Sterling Estate. They had actually done it. They had committed their theft to paper, and were cheerfully handing it out to every single person we knew, completely banking on the assumption that I would be too ashamed or too weak to challenge them publicly. I handed the card back to Mrs. Higgins with a polite, effortless smile, masking the absolute firestorm brewing in my chest. Growing up, Brenda had always taken whatever I earned and repackaged it as Maya's destiny. I vividly remembered a time when I was 16 years old. I had won a highly competitive statewide academic grant that came with a heavy financial prize. I came home practically vibrating with pride and excitement. But the very following Sunday, Brenda stood up in front of the entire church congregation and announced that Maya, who had just been caught forging a report card, had magically secured a prestigious internship. Brenda had completely erased my achievement to build a protective shield around Maya's failures. Because of that, I had spent my entire adult life building my corporate real estate empire in absolute silence. I kept my massive wealth hidden. I kept my property acquisitions hidden. I played the role of a comfortable mid-level office worker because it kept the target off my back. But this was no longer a high school award. This was my wedding, my property, and my life. I left Julian chatting with one of my uncles near the grill and purposefully made my way over to the food tents. Brenda was standing by the potato salad station loading up a plate while simultaneously bragging to a group of my cousins about how Connor's family basically owned half of Manhattan. I stopped right next to her and calmly picked up a serving spoon. I kept my voice low, steady, and entirely devoid of the emotional hysteria she was desperately hoping to provoke. I looked her dead in the eye and asked her if she truly believed that printing a stolen date on a piece of glossy cardboard was going to magically alter reality. Brenda stiffened instantly. She dropped her plate onto the folding table with a loud, dramatic clatter that immediately drew the attention of everyone standing within a 30-foot radius. This was exactly what she wanted. She wanted a stage. She turned to face me, her eyes flashing with a highly practiced, victimized outrage. She did not whisper. She projected her voice so that the deacons, the cousins, and the neighborhood elders could hear every single syllable. Brenda puffed out her chest and launched into her favorite, deeply ingrained routine. She loudly demanded to know why I was so bitterly determined to ruin my younger sister's blessing. She accused me of suffering from a classic crab-in-a-barrel mentality, claiming I was so deeply jealous of Maya's social upgrade that I was willing to tear our family apart. She pointed a sharp finger at my chest and told the surrounding crowd that I had completely forgotten where I came from just because I had a comfortable little desk job and a few extra dollars in my savings account. She loudly shamed me for not stepping aside gracefully, insisting that Connor's family was bringing real wealth, true prestige, and vital corporate connections to our bloodline. She claimed this was a level of societal elevation that Julian and I could never possibly achieve. I stood there holding the serving spoon, listening to my mother degrade my fiancé, my career, and my character in front of the people who had watched me grow up. She called Connor an upgrade. If she only knew what was sitting in the highly encrypted PDF file on my phone right at that very moment. If she only knew that her precious elite high society future son-in-law was currently drowning in millions of dollars of toxic corporate debt. His highly publicized tech startup was nothing more than a smoking crater of bankruptcy, and his wealthy parents had completely cut him off. He was absolutely broke. He was desperate. And he was currently looking for a naive, newly rich family to bail him out of his impending legal disaster. The irony was so intensely sharp it almost burned the back of my throat. Brenda and Maya were draining every cent they had forging venue contracts and burning family bridges to fund a fake lavish wedding for a man who had absolutely nothing to his name. They were actively tying themselves to a sinking ship, and they were trying to drag my venue down with them. I was just about to open my mouth and tell Brenda exactly how hollow her pathetic social climbing truly was when a heavy, uninvited hand landed flat and hard on my shoulder. The distinct, overpowering smell of expensive designer cologne washed over me. Connor stepped up right beside Brenda, slipping his other arm possessively around Maya's waist as she trotted over to join the public spectacle. He looked down at me with a smirk that was equal parts sheer arrogance and condescending pity. He leaned in incredibly close, bringing his face just inches from my ear. Dropping his voice to a conspiratorial whisper meant only for me to hear. He told me I needed to stop embarrassing myself in front of his future mother-in-law. He chuckled softly, a harsh grating sound, and whispered that I was fighting a completely losing battle because his parents' elite corporate lawyers had already seized the Sterling estate contract first thing this morning. He looked me up and down, making it blatantly clear he viewed me as a financially struggling mid-level administrative worker who could not possibly afford the astronomical legal fees required to fight his family's vast resources. He patted my shoulder condescendingly and told me to just grab a plate of barbecue and enjoy the party because the venue was officially his. I did not blink, I did not argue. I slowly turned my head and looked him dead in the eyes. I just stared at this bankrupt, desperate fraud standing in my aunt's backyard, threatening me with non-existent lawyers over a luxury property he could never ever afford. A slow, chilling grin spread completely across my face. Connor's arrogant grin was permanently plastered across his face, absolutely convinced he had just delivered a fatal checkmate. Julian, who had been standing silently by my side, felt the shift in energy. He took a deliberate, heavy step forward, his jaw clenched, ready to physically remove Connor from my personal space. I raised my hand and placed it gently against Julian's chest. I did not need my fiancé to fight this battle. I had the ultimate ammunition sitting right in the palm of my hand. I looked up at Connor and let my own smile widen, mirroring his arrogance but lacing it with something far more lethal. I took a step back to ensure I had enough room to project my voice. The Juneteenth cookout was buzzing with laughter and music, but I knew exactly how to command a room. Or in this case, a backyard. I raised my voice, pitching it perfectly so that it carried over the R&B track playing from the outdoor speakers. I clapped my hands together and loudly congratulated Connor. I announced to the surrounding crowd that Connor and Maya had officially secured the Sterling estate for their wedding. The effect was instantaneous. Auntie Vivian's backyard, normally a loud and joyous epicenter of family celebrations, suddenly went dead silent. The uncles working the massive smoker paused, tongs suspended in the air. The older women sitting in the shade stopped fanning themselves. Even the children chasing each other across the grass seemed to sense the abrupt shift in the atmosphere and skidded to a halt. Every single pair of eyes zeroed in on our little group by the potato salad station. I kept my voice bright and relentlessly cheerful, playing the role of the supportive older sister to absolute perfection. I told Connor how incredibly impressed I was by his legal maneuvering. I said it took true audacity to hijack a luxury venue contract on such incredibly short notice. Maya beamed, completely oblivious to the trap I was laying. She leaned into Connor, soaking up the attention of the neighborhood, assuming I was finally publicly conceding defeat. She looked at her friends and loudly declared that when you marry a man with real wealth and connections, impossible things just happen naturally. I nodded in eager agreement. I told Maya she was absolutely right. Then I turned my focus entirely back to Connor. The temperature in my voice dropped to a freezing clinical register. I looked him dead in the eyes and innocently asked how his parents planned to cover the remaining $100,000 balance required by the Sterling estate before the end of the month. Connor blinked. His arrogant smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before he quickly pasted it back on. He puffed out his chest and loudly proclaimed that $100,000 was pocket change for a family like his. He boasted that his tech startup had just closed another massive quarter, and his parents were more than happy to foot the bill for their future daughter-in-law. I let out a slow, deliberate sigh. I pulled my phone from my purse, unlocked the screen, and opened the highly encrypted file my private investigator had sent me just hours ago. I held the phone up so Connor could see the bright, glaring letters at the top of the official court document. I asked him if his parents were paying the venue balance out of their personal accounts or if they were planning to liquidate the remaining ergonomic office chairs from his failed company to cover the cost. I did not whisper. I made sure my voice resonated clearly across the entire patio. I asked Connor how a highly successful tech CEO could possibly afford a luxury estate wedding when he had quietly filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy exactly 14 days ago in a Delaware federal court. The music track abruptly ended, and whoever was manning the playlist did not hit the next button. The silence in the yard was absolute and suffocating. The elders turned their heads, exchanging sharp, knowing glances. Auntie Vivian stepped out onto her back porch, crossing her arms over her chest, watching the spectacle with keen interest. Connor turned ghostly pale. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His jaw went slack and he stumbled backward a half step, looking like the ground had just vanished beneath his expensive loafer. He stared at my phone screen, his eyes wide with sheer panic as he read his own official bankruptcy docket number. For a man who had spent the last 2 years parading around our family gatherings like a billionaire tech prodigy, the exposure was immediate and brutal. I did not stop there. I detailed exactly what was in the file for the benefit of my captive audience. I talked about the millions of dollars in toxic corporate debt. I mentioned the unpaid employee wages. I brought up the luxury cars that were currently in the process of being repossessed. I painted a crystal clear picture of a desperate broke fraud who was using his family name as a shield while his entire financial world burned to ash. Maya let out a piercing, hysterical shriek. She lunged forward, slapping her hand against my phone to push it away. Her face was contorted with a mixture of terror and furious denial. She screamed that I was a jealous, lying dropout. She yelled that I had fabricated the documents because I could not stand to see her marry a high-class man. She frantically grabbed Connor's arm, shaking him, begging him to tell everyone that I was just a bitter, lonely woman trying to ruin the happiest time of her life. But Connor could not speak. He was hyperventilating, his eyes darting wildly around the yard as he realized his carefully constructed facade was entirely destroyed. He looked at Maya, then at the crowd, and finally down at his feet. His silence was the loudest confession he could have possibly given. The whispers started immediately. A low, steady hum of gossip rippled through the cookout. Cousins leaned into each other, shaking their heads. The uncles at the grill muttered about a grown man lying about his pocketbook. Maya was unraveling in real time, sobbing and stomping her foot on the patio stones, demanding that someone defend her. That is when Brenda aggressively pushed her way through the crowd. She shoved past Julian, nearly knocking over a stack of serving trays, and positioned herself directly between me and her precious golden couple. Her face was an ugly shade of crimson, her eyes blazing with irrational fury. She pointed a manicured finger right in my face and ordered me to shut my mouth. Brenda declared loudly that I had no idea what I was talking about. She defended Connor with a blind, desperate loyalty, insisting that the business world was complicated and that a temporary restructuring did not mean he was broke. She yelled that I was a petty, vindictive child who spent too much time snooping into other people's business instead of finding a decent man of my own. I looked at my mother with pure disgust. I asked her how she could possibly defend a man who was actively lying to her favorite daughter. I asked her how they were going to pay the remaining venue balance for the Sterling estate now that Connor's credit was completely decimated. Brenda stood taller, lifting her chin with a triumphant, defiant glare. She looked around the yard, wanting everyone to witness her absolute devotion to Maya's happiness. She loudly declared that Connor did not need to rely on his parents' money, and he certainly did not need his company's funds to pay for the venue. She proudly announced that the $100,000 venue balance had already been paid in full. She said she took care of it herself first thing this morning. I frowned, genuinely confused for a split second. I knew my mother's finances. She lived comfortably, but she did not have $100,000 in liquid cash just sitting around to wire to a wedding venue on a Tuesday morning. I asked her exactly where she got that kind of money. Brenda smirked. It was a cold, calculating look that made the summer heat suddenly feel freezing. She looked me right in the eye and proudly stated that she had wired the money directly into Connor's personal checking account so his lawyers could secure the contract, and she had pulled every single penny of it directly from the family trust. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. The air rushed out of my lungs. My blood turned to absolute ice in my veins. The family trust. It was not just any trust. It was the untouchable, sacred account established by my late grandmother before she passed away. It was an ironclad fund meant to be split exactly 50-50 between Maya and me, but only upon our 35th birthdays. It was my grandmother's life savings, the money she had scrubbed floors and saved pennies for meant to secure our futures. Neither of us had legal access to it yet. I was 32. Maya was 30. I stared at Brenda, my mind racing as the horrific reality of her words began to set in. To move $100,000 out of that specific trust, Brenda would have needed authorization from both beneficiaries. I had never signed a single document. I had never authorized a transfer. I had not even spoken to the bank in years. I looked at my mother's proud, defiant face and then down at Connor, who was suddenly looking a bit more colorful, knowing he had 100 grand sitting fresh in his fraudulent bank account. Brenda had not just bailed out a bankrupt liar. To access those massive funds, my mother had to have forged my signature. She had stolen $50,000 of my inheritance, combined it with Maya's half, and handed it over to a man who was legally drowning in debt. The backyard faded away. The music, the whispers, the smell of the barbecue all vanished. There was only the cold, undeniable realization that my mother had just committed a massive felony to fund a wedding that was built on a foundation of absolute lies. I did not say another word. I turned around, grabbed Julian's hand, and walked straight out of the yard. I needed to call my corporate attorneys immediately. Let the rats enter the maze, because the trap I was about to set was going to be inescapable. My phone vibrated against the polished mahogany table, shattering the silence of the sleek glass-walled conference room. The panoramic views of the Atlanta skyline usually grounded me, a sprawling reminder of the commercial real estate empire I had spent the last decade building from the ground up. But this morning, the view offered no comfort. I was sitting across from my elite legal team, and the atmosphere was thick with a clinical, terrifying tension. Harrison, my lead corporate litigator, sat to my right with his hands tightly clasped. Marcus, the private investigator who had unearthed Connor's bankruptcy, sat across from him. Between them lay a thick, heavily secured manila folder containing the bank records we had subpoenaed first thing that morning using our emergency fraud protocols. The drive home from Auntie Vivian's Juneteenth cookout had been a blur of calculating silence. I had left Brenda and Maya basking in the backyard, proudly boasting about transferring $100,000 from the family trust. That trust was sacred. My late grandmother had spent 40 grueling years scrubbing floors and eventually running a local catering business to build that fund. It was an ironclad, irrevocable trust, explicitly designed to be split 50-50 between Maya and me, solely upon our 35th birthdays. Neither of us had the legal authority to withdraw a single dime, let alone my mother. Harrison slid the open folder toward me. His usually stoic face was tight with absolute disgust. He stated that the numbers were not just a minor breach, they were a catastrophic federal-level financial crime. Brenda had not merely taken the $100,000 to cover the Sterling Estate venue balance. She had completely liquidated the entire $500,000 trust. I looked down at the crisp white pages of the bank statements. There was my signature meticulously forged at the bottom of a high-level authorization release form. Brenda had spent years perfecting the art of copying my handwriting to sign my high school permission slips, and she had arrogantly assumed she could use that same pathetic parlor trick on a federally insured financial document. The paper trail was completely undeniable. Harrison pointed a heavy silver pen at the itemized transfers outlining exactly where my grandmother's legacy had gone. A massive chunk had been wired directly into Connor's newly restructured personal accounts to aggressively pay off the creditors breathing down his neck from his bankrupt tech startup. Another significant portion had gone to high-end luxury car dealerships to quietly cover the leases Connor was weeks away from defaulting on. The rest had been heavily funneled into Maya's wedding aesthetics. She had used my stolen inheritance to book celebrity caterers, highly sought-after event planners, and a fleet of pristine vintage cars. They were actively financing a millionaire lifestyle using stolen funds while standing in my aunt's backyard, calling me a jealous mid-level worker. Harrison leaned forward, his voice dropping to a cold clinical register. He stated that we had more than enough irrefutable evidence to file immediate felony fraud and grand larceny charges against Brenda. He detailed how he could have federal investigators at her suburban doorstep before noon. He promised to freeze every single asset associated with Connor and Maya, effectively halting the wedding preparations in their tracks and putting my mother in handcuffs by dinner time. The image of Brenda being perp-walked out of her home was incredibly tempting. It was the swift, brutal justice she absolutely deserved for desecrating my grandmother's life's work. But I raised my hand, palm facing outward, stopping Harrison mid-sentence. I looked around the glass conference room, taking in the confused expressions of my ruthless legal team. I explained to them that striking right now would be a massive strategic error. I knew my mother's psychological playbook perfectly. If we sent the police today, Brenda would instantly weaponize her arrest. She would stand in front of a judge crying theatrical tears, claiming she was just a desperate mother trying to secure a future for her daughter against a technical banking error. She would spin a masterclass narrative to the entire community, portraying me as a vindictive, money-obsessed billionaire who cared more about hoarding wealth than seeing her own sister happily married. The neighborhood would view her as a martyr, and I would be the villain who sent my own mother to prison over cash. I told Harrison we were not going to file the charges, not yet. I instructed my legal team to completely stand down and let the fraudulent transfers process without any interference. Harrison looked at me like I had lost my mind, arguing that allowing them to spend the money would make it infinitely harder to recover the funds later. I smiled a sharp, calculating grin and told him the money was irrelevant. I wanted them to spend it. I wanted them to sign every single ironclad, non-refundable contract they could find. I wanted them to lock themselves into secondary vendor agreements, luxury rental leases, and high-penalty catering commitments. I explained that Brenda and Maya were operating under the profound delusion that Connor was going to inherit a massive fortune that would eventually replenish the stolen trust funds. They were building a colossal house of cards on a foundation of absolute lies. If we stopped them now, they would simply cancel the wedding, hide the debt, and play the victim. But if we let them proceed, they would legally bind themselves to hundreds of thousands of dollars in financial obligations that Connor could never ever pay. And the absolute best part of my strategy revolved around the venue itself. They still believed the Sterling estate belonged to a faceless corporate management group. They had no idea that my commercial holding company was the sole owner of the property. They had literally wired my stolen trust fund money directly into my own corporate accounts to rent my own property. I was going to let them plan the wedding of the century. I was going to let them invite every single high society contact, church elder, and wealthy neighbor they knew. I wanted them to stand in the absolute center of the grandest stage possible when the floor finally gave out. Harrison slowly leaned back in his leather chair, a look of profound, terrifying respect washing over his face as he realized the sheer magnitude of the trap I was building. He closed the manila folder and nodded, agreeing to monitor the accounts silently and prepare the civil and criminal filings for the exact moment I gave the final green light. The meeting adjourned, and I remained alone in the conference room, looking out over the sprawling city skyline. The silence was broken by another sharp vibration from my cell phone sitting on the table. The screen lit up with a new text message from Maya. I picked it up and read the words, marveling at the sheer, unadulterated arrogance radiating from the screen. Maya was bragging loudly in a group chat that included several of our cousins and church members. She typed out a long, obnoxious message detailing the extravagant rehearsal dinner she and Connor were officially hosting at the Sterling estate the night before the wedding. She boasted about the imported caviar, the custom ice sculptures, and the elite guest list, claiming it would be the social event of the decade. She ended the message with a passive-aggressive note directed specifically at me, saying she hoped I could manage to get the time off work to attend, since it would be a once-in-a-lifetime chance for me to see how true luxury operated. I did not reply to the group chat. I simply closed the messaging app and opened my secure contacts list. I dialed the direct line for the Sterling Estate's general property manager. When he answered, I gave him a very specific set of instructions regarding the upcoming booking under Connor's name. I told him to grant the wedding party absolutely full, unrestricted access to the grounds for their rehearsal dinner and all upcoming wedding preparations. I instructed him to accommodate their every request, roll out the red carpet, and ensure they felt like absolute royalty the moment they stepped through the iron gates. I hung up the phone and looked back out at the city. My grandmother's legacy was not going to be squandered on a bankrupt fraud and a jealous sister. It was going to be the exact instrument of their total public dismantling. Let the rats enter the maze. The following morning, the brilliant Atlanta sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my top-floor corner office, casting long, sharp shadows across my solid oak desk. Operating a commercial real estate empire requires absolute precision and unwavering control, and my corporate headquarters was the physical embodiment of that exact philosophy. The building was a sleek, 50-story glass and steel monolith situated right in the beating heart of the financial district. I owned every single square foot of it. I was in the middle of reviewing the final architectural blueprints for a massive new mixed-use development when the encrypted intercom on my desk chimed. My executive assistant, Sarah, spoke with a tight, highly apologetic edge to her professional voice. She informed me that a woman loudly claiming to be my mother was currently downstairs in the main lobby, actively harassing the front desk staff and aggressively demanding to see me immediately. I did not panic. I did not rush. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my dark roast coffee, adjusted the lapels of my custom-tailored blazer, and calmly took the private executive elevator down to the ground floor. When the polished steel doors silently slid open, the sheer grating volume of Brenda's voice instantly assaulted my ears. The main lobby of my building is a serene, cavernous space featuring imported Italian marble floors and a massive indoor waterfall designed to project quiet, intimidating authority. Brenda was currently treating this multi-million-dollar space like a discount department store customer service desk. She was leaning heavily over the sweeping curved reception counter, tapping her long acrylic nails impatiently against the pristine glass and loudly berating my highly trained security receptionist. Brenda was wearing a brightly colored, heavily patterned sundress that screamed for attention, looking completely ridiculous and entirely out of place among the sea of charcoal and navy business suits moving purposefully through the lobby. I walked up quietly behind her just in time to hear her inform my staff that I was a low-level administrative assistant who desperately needed to be pulled away from fetching coffee because a family emergency took absolute precedence over my basic clerical paperwork. I stepped up to the marble counter and addressed her with a cool, detached tone. I asked Brenda exactly what kind of catastrophic emergency required her to trespass into a private corporate facility on a Wednesday morning. Brenda spun around, instantly transforming her aggressive scowl into a sickly sweet, entirely manufactured smile. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering critically on my expensive suit, clearly assuming I had spent my entire meager paycheck trying to look important at a dead-end job. She reached into her oversized designer handbag and aggressively slapped a thick stapled legal document onto the glass reception desk. I glanced down at the pages. It was exactly what my lead litigator, Harrison, had predicted. It was a retroactive trust waiver hastily drafted by whatever cheap strip mall legal counsel Connor had managed to scrounge up on short notice. The document essentially stated that I voluntarily surrendered all rights claims and past balances of my grandmother's family trust, officially absolving all parties of any financial or criminal liability. Brenda actually expected me to sign away my legal right to pursue felony fraud charges against her. Brenda slid a heavy gold pen across the glass counter toward me. She lowered her voice into a tone of mock sympathy, playing the role of the long-suffering mother dealing with a difficult, stubborn child. She told me she knew I was struggling with the harsh reality of Maya's upcoming wedding. She said it was completely natural for an older, unmarried sister to feel a deep, agonizing sense of inadequacy when a younger, prettier sibling secures a high-class man like Connor. She patted the fraudulent document and told me to just sign the papers so we could put all this unnecessary childish tension behind us and move forward as a family. When I did not immediately reach for the pen, Brenda leaned in closer, dropping the supportive mother act and letting her true toxic venom bleed through. She whispered that I had always been the difficult one, the selfish child who absolutely refused to share the spotlight. She loudly accused me of holding a petty, pathetic grudge over a simple administrative bank transfer. Brenda looked me dead in the eye and told me to stop being so deeply bitter just because a wealthy elite man chose my sister instead of me. She said signing the waiver was the only way I could prove I was not a jealous crab in a barrel failure trying to drag Maya down to my own miserable, lonely level. I looked at the waiver. I looked at the gold pen. Then I looked back at my mother. The sheer blinding audacity of her standing in my building demanding I sign away the indisputable evidence of her federal crime while simultaneously calling me a failure was absolutely breathtaking. I did not pick up the pen. I placed my index finger on the center of the document and slowly, deliberately slid it straight back across the glass counter until it hit Brenda's hand. I told her in a voice devoid of all emotion that I would absolutely not be signing a retroactive waiver for a fraudulently liquidated trust account. I informed her that the $500,000 she stole to fund Maya's delusional wedding and Connor's bankrupt lifestyle was gone, and no piece of cheap legal fiction was going to protect her from the massive life-altering fallout heading her way. Brenda's eyes narrowed into dangerous, hateful slits. The fake maternal warmth evaporated completely, leaving nothing but cold, ruthless anger. She snatched the document off the counter and took a highly threatening step toward me. She raised her voice, ensuring the security personnel stationed near the elevator banks could hear her. She told me I was making the biggest mistake of my pathetic, insignificant life. She threatened to bypass me entirely and go straight to human resources. She promised to march upstairs, find my department manager, and inform them that I was a hostile, unstable employee who was currently harassing a family member on company time. She vowed to have me fired, boxed up, and thrown out onto the street before my lunch break. I did not blink. I did not break eye contact. I simply reached out and pressed a small, discreet silver button located on the underside of the reception desk. Within 3 seconds, the heavy synchronized footsteps of my private security detail echoed across the marble floor. 4 massive men in tailored dark suits materialized directly behind Brenda, forming a solid, impenetrable wall of intimidation. Brenda saw them approaching, and her face lit up with a triumphant, malicious grin. She completely misread the situation. She aggressively pointed a finger at me and began shouting at the security guards. She loudly demanded that they escort me back to my cubicle and immediately summoned the highest-ranking manager in the building. She screamed that she had high-level connections in this city and would personally see to it that my administrative career was permanently ruined for disrespecting my own mother. The head of security, a towering former military operative named Marcus, who reported exclusively to me, stepped forward. He did not look at Brenda. He looked directly at me, his posture perfectly straight, and respectfully asked for my orders. I simply nodded toward the front revolving doors. Marcus turned his attention to my mother. His voice was a deep, resonant rumble that commanded absolute, unquestionable authority. He calmly informed Brenda that she was currently trespassing on private commercial property and causing a public disturbance. Brenda scoffed loudly, attempting to push past his massive frame, demanding again to speak to the CEO so she could have me immediately terminated for insubordination. Marcus did not move a single inch. He looked down at Brenda with an expression of complete, unwavering stoicism. He informed her in a voice that echoed clearly across the suddenly silent lobby that she was already speaking to the CEO. He told my mother that she was currently standing in a corporate headquarters that I owned entirely, threatening the sole proprietor of a multi-million-dollar real estate firm, and if she did not leave the premises in exactly 10 seconds, she would be leaving in the back of a police cruiser. The color instantly vanished from Brenda's face. The glossy trust waiver slipped from her trembling fingers and hit the polished marble floor with a soft, pathetic slap. Marcus stepped forward, his massive frame completely blocking Brenda from my view. He calmly instructed his team to escort the trespasser from the premises. Brenda finally found her voice, but it was no longer a booming, arrogant threat. It was a high-pitched, frantic screech. She thrashed against the firm grip of the highly trained security officers, screaming my name, demanding that I tell them who she was. I simply turned my back and walked toward the private elevator. I did not owe that woman another second of my time. My focus was entirely on the endgame. The next 14 days were a masterclass in compartmentalization and absolute precision. While Brenda and Maya scrambled to execute a wedding funded by federal crimes, Julian and I were quietly finalizing the details of our own marriage. The contrast between our genuine partnership and Maya's toxic, manufactured facade could not have been more glaring. Julian did not care about social climbing or projecting a false image of immense wealth to impress strangers. He cared about building a foundation that could withstand any storm. We sat in the private tasting room of a Michelin-starred caterer, sampling courses for our upcoming reception. Julian held my hand under the table, seamlessly handling the vendor negotiations and logistical details so I could focus entirely on managing my corporate empire and monitoring the trap I had set for my family. He reviewed vendor contracts with a sharp analytical eye, ensuring every single clause was fair and transparent. There were no hidden debts, no frantic calls from creditors, and absolutely no stolen funds. Julian was a man who brought profound peace to my life, not chaos. He proved every single day what a real functioning partnership looked like. We were a solid team. Connor and Maya were just two drowning rats fighting over a sinking piece of driftwood. Meanwhile, Maya was living in an absolute alternate reality, and she was aggressively broadcasting every single second of her delusion to the world. My phone buzzed constantly with notifications from her various social media accounts. She was posting dozens of updates daily documenting her elite wedding preparations at the Sterling estate. I sat at my massive oak desk, sipping my morning espresso, watching high-definition videos of my sister twirling through the manicured gardens of the commercial property I owned. Maya posted endless photos of the imported silk table linens, the massive floral arches costing tens of thousands of dollars, and the custom crystal stemware she had rented for the weekend. She captioned every post with nauseating hashtags about marrying into old money and securing generational wealth. She was actively bragging about spending the exact funds Brenda had illegally siphoned from our grandmother's sacred trust account. But the absolute peak of her audacity came 3 days before the rehearsal dinner. Maya posted a 5-minute video specifically dedicated to mocking me. She sat on the grand marble staircase of the Sterling estate, wearing a designer pre-wedding outfit, and looked directly into the camera with a smug, pitying smile. She told her thousands of followers that her bitter older sister had completely vanished from the narrative. She claimed that my silence over the past week was absolute proof of my profound, pathetic jealousy. Maya laughed a sharp, grating sound and boasted that she had officially run me out of town. She told the camera that some women simply could not handle being in the presence of true, high-class luxury, and that my complete absence was the best wedding gift she could have ever asked for. I watched the video twice. I did not feel a single ounce of anger. I felt nothing but a cold, clinical anticipation. If you looked closely at the background of Maya's video, you could see the massive cracks forming in her perfect facade. Connor was pacing frantically near the garden entrance, a phone pressed hard against his ear, his face pale and sweating profusely. He was likely dodging another round of aggressive calls from the bankruptcy trustees, or the federal fraud investigators closing in on his newly acquired funds. The walls were rapidly shrinking around them, and Maya was completely oblivious, too busy staring at her own reflection in the camera lens to notice the heavy smoke filling the room. My intercom chimed, pulling me away from Maya's social media spectacle. My property manager at the Sterling estate had just forwarded the final confirmed guest list and security clearance sheet for Connor and Maya's rehearsal dinner. I opened the encrypted file on my monitor and leaned back in my leather chair, scanning the names line by line. The guest list was a comprehensive catalog of Connor's snobby old money family and their elite social circle. His father, a retired state judge, and his mother, a prominent local socialite, headed the list. A slew of wealthy corporate connections, arrogant aunts, and judgmental uncles were all confirmed to attend the Friday night event. They had all flown in on first-class tickets, booked luxury hotel suites in the downtown district, and prepared to celebrate the union of two prominent families. They were arriving with their noses firmly in the air, ready to look down on my family's humble background, completely convinced that their golden boy was a tech prodigy, generously elevating a middle-class girl. They had absolutely no idea that their precious son had quietly filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy just weeks ago in a Delaware court. They were entirely ignorant of the fact that the lavish event they were attending, the imported caviar they were about to eat, and the vintage champagne they were going to drink were entirely funded by a massive felony wire fraud orchestrated by the bride's own mother. Connor had lied to everyone. He had looked his own wealthy, judgmental parents in the eye and projected total financial dominance while secretly drowning in toxic corporate debt. And Brenda had willingly handed him the stolen life preserver he needed to keep the charade going just a little bit longer. The trap was not just set, it was fully loaded, locked, and primed for absolute destruction. I printed a physical copy of the guest list, folded it neatly along the crease, and placed it inside my leather briefcase. When Friday evening finally arrived, the air in the city felt thick with heavy anticipation. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my dressing room, adjusting the cuffs of my outfit. I was not going to crash this highly anticipated event wearing a standard cocktail dress or playing the role of a slighted emotional sister. I was wearing a perfectly tailored midnight blue power suit. The cut was sharp, lethal, and commanded absolute, undeniable respect. I paired it with minimal, high-impact jewelry and a sleek, immaculate hairstyle. I looked exactly like what I was, a highly successful corporate CEO preparing to actively liquidate a terrible investment. Julian stepped up behind me, wrapping his strong arms around my waist and pressing a soft kiss to my neck. He wore a sharp charcoal gray suit that complemented mine perfectly. He met my eyes in the mirror and smiled, serving as a calm, steady anchor in the massive storm I was about to unleash. He told me I looked absolutely terrifying, and he meant it as the highest possible compliment a partner could give. We walked out to the private motor court of my building, where a pristine chauffeured Maybach was already idling its powerful engine, a low, steady hum in the cool evening air. The back door opened, and Auntie Vivian was waiting inside. I had visited Auntie Vivian 2 days ago and laid out the entire unvarnished truth. I showed her the official bank statements. I showed her the forged trust documents. I explained exactly how Brenda had desecrated our late grandmother's life savings to fund a completely fraudulent lifestyle. Auntie Vivian had not cried. She had sat in total silence for a long time, her face slowly hardening into a mask of pure, righteous fury. My grandmother had been her mother too. Brenda had not just betrayed me, she had actively betrayed the entire bloodline. Auntie Vivian had immediately demanded to be in the car when the hammer finally fell. I slid into the plush leather seat across from my aunt, with Julian taking the spot directly next to me. The heavy doors closed automatically, sealing us in a bubble of quiet luxury. I tapped the privacy glass dividing us from the driver and gave a single perfectly calm instruction. I told him to take us to the Sterling estate. The vehicle glided smoothly onto the highway, heading toward the sprawling grounds of my commercial property. Maya and Connor were currently inside my building, eating my food, drinking my wine, and boasting to their snobby relatives about their invincible wealth and superior status. They genuinely thought they had won the war. They thought they had successfully run me out of town and secured their fraudulent happily ever after without any consequences. They were about to learn a very hard, very public, and highly devastating lesson about what happens when you steal from the wrong woman. The calm before the storm was officially over. It was time to crash a rehearsal dinner. The Sterling estate was a masterpiece of architectural grandeur, a sprawling testament to historic wealth, but tonight it had been transformed into a glowing monument to absolute fraud. From the tinted windows of the Maybach, I watched the spectacle unfold. Thousands of delicate fairy lights had been meticulously woven through the branches of the ancient oak trees lining the property, casting a warm, ethereal glow over the manicured lawns. A live string quartet was positioned on the elevated stone terrace, filling the cool evening air with classical music. Waiters in immaculate white tuxedos circulated seamlessly through the crowd, balancing heavy silver trays loaded with beluga caviar, artisan hors d'oeuvres, and crystal flutes of vintage champagne. Every single detail screamed of limitless luxury. Every single detail had been paid for with my stolen inheritance. Over 100 guests milled about the immaculate grounds, dressed in strict black tie attire. This was not a gathering of our family or childhood friends. This was an aggressive display of Connor's elite social circle. I scanned the crowd and immediately spotted his parents holding court near the massive outdoor fire pit. His father, a retired state judge with a stern, deeply lined face, and his mother, a prominent local socialite dripping in understated diamonds, stood with perfect, rigid posture. They were surrounded by a gaggle of wealthy corporate executives and old money aristocrats. And right there, desperately orbiting the edge of their elite circle, was Brenda. My mother was wearing a heavily sequined gown that was entirely too flashy for a refined rehearsal dinner. She was laughing loudly at jokes she clearly did not understand, nodding vigorously, and trying with every ounce of her being to project an image of equal status. But the disdain on Eleanor Thornton's face was unmistakable. Connor's mother looked down her nose at Brenda with a tight, patronizing smile, tolerating my mother's presence the way one tolerates an overly enthusiastic servant. Brenda was humiliating herself, eagerly trading away her own dignity for a seat at a table built on her future son-in-law's fabricated wealth. Maya was floating through the crowd a few yards away, practically vibrating with self-importance. She was clinging to Connor's arm, loudly broadcasting her newly elevated status to anyone forced to listen. Just hours ago, she had posted another obnoxious video claiming she had chased me out of town, boasting that her sheer elegance had sent me running into hiding. She genuinely believed her own delusions. She had no idea she was dancing on a trapdoor, and I held the lever. I turned away from the window and looked at Julian. He sat perfectly relaxed beside me in his sharp charcoal suit, projecting a quiet, unshakable confidence. Over the past 2 weeks, while Maya and Brenda were frantically throwing stolen money at a bankrupt man's facade, Julian and I had seamlessly finalized the remaining details of our own wedding. He had handled contract negotiations, vetted our high-end vendors, and supported my corporate maneuvers with flawless execution. He never complained, never sought the spotlight, and never made me feel like my success was a threat to his masculinity. He was a true partner. Sitting across from us, Auntie Vivian radiated a terrifying, silent fury. She wore a tailored black dress and a string of pearls that had belonged to my grandmother. She was not here for a party. She was here to witness the execution. The heavy iron gates of the Sterling estate loomed ahead. The private security guards stationed at the entrance stepped forward, raising their hands to halt the vehicle. But as the Maybach rolled into the pool of light, the lead guard caught sight of the specialized corporate license plate and the discreet emblem on the windshield. His posture instantly changed. He dropped his hand, snapped to rigid attention, and frantically signaled his partner to open the heavy iron gates immediately. They bowed their heads respectfully as our vehicle glided smoothly past them and onto the private grounds. The driver pulled the Maybach up to the edge of the grand stone pathway leading to the main terrace. Julian stepped out first, adjusting his jacket before turning to offer me his hand. I stepped out into the crisp night air, my heels clicking sharply against the cobblestone. I smoothed the lines of my tailored midnight blue power suit. I did not look like a guest. I looked like the owner. Auntie Vivian emerged gracefully behind me, her expression carved from stone. We did not wait for an escort. We walked directly up the illuminated pathway toward the heart of the celebration. The sheer force of our collective presence seemed to part the sea of guests. The old money aristocrats instinctively stepped aside, murmuring to one another as they took in my unapologetic, commanding stride and the imposing figures flanking me. The string quartet continued to play, but a noticeable tense ripple spread through the crowd. Brenda was mid-laugh with Judge Thornton when she finally turned her head and saw me. The reaction was instantaneous. The fragile crystal champagne flute slipped from her trembling fingers and shattered violently against the stone patio. The sharp crash echoed over the music, causing several nearby guests to jump. Brenda's face drained of all color, replacing her desperate, fawning smile with a mask of absolute panic and explosive rage. She did not hesitate. She lunged forward, grabbing Connor by the sleeve of his expensive tuxedo and dragging him forcefully toward me. Maya, noticing the sudden commotion, let out a sharp gasp and hurried to follow them, her designer heels stumbling slightly on the paving stones. Brenda marched directly into my path, positioning herself between me and the wealthy crowd she was so desperate to impress. Her chest was heaving, her eyes wild with a mixture of terror and furious indignation. She pointed a manicured, trembling finger directly at my face and raised her voice to a shrill, grating pitch, ensuring that every single person within a 50-foot radius could hear her. She demanded to know how I dared to show my face at such an exclusive event. She completely abandoned her refined high society act and leaned into pure, unfiltered aggression. Brenda loudly proclaimed to the surrounding guests that I was nothing but a jealous, bitter dropout who was entirely obsessed with ruining her sister's happiness. She yelled that I had spent my entire life being difficult and lonely, and that I was completely incapable of handling the fact that a high-class wealthy man like Connor had chosen Maya instead of me. Maya stepped up beside our mother, crossing her arms and sneering. She told me I was pathetic for showing up uninvited just to beg for attention. She loudly declared that I did not belong among elite company and that my presence was actively polluting her perfect night. Connor, however, did not say a single word. He was standing slightly behind Brenda, looking like he was about to be physically sick. His face was a sickly ashen gray, and a thick layer of sweat had formed on his forehead. His eyes darted nervously between me, Julian, and his own parents, standing a few yards away. He knew exactly what I held in my briefcase. He knew his fraudulent tech empire was dead, his bankruptcy was undeniable, and his entire life was a carefully constructed lie. He looked like a man standing on the tracks staring directly at an oncoming freight train entirely paralyzed by fear. Brenda threw her hands in the air, playing the victimized mother to absolute perfection. She spun around and frantically waved toward the perimeter of the terrace, screaming for security. She yelled that she wanted this unstable, jealous woman removed from the premises immediately before I ruined the most important night of her daughter's life. From the shadows of the grand stone archway, the head of estate security stepped forward. He was a towering, broad-shouldered man wearing a dark, impeccably tailored suit and a discreet earpiece. He moved with a swift, intimidating grace, walking directly toward our tense standoff. Brenda's face lit up with a malicious, triumphant grin. She stepped aside, gesturing aggressively toward me, fully expecting the massive guard to grab me by the arms and humiliate me in front of the entire elite crowd. She looked at Eleanor Thornton, silently begging for approval for handling the trash so efficiently. But the head of security did not reach for me. He did not even look at Brenda. He stepped directly past my mother, completely ignoring her frantic pointing finger. He stopped, a respectful 2 feet in front of me, squared his massive shoulders, and clasped his hands formally behind his back. He gave a slight deferential bow of his head. His deep, resonant voice carried clearly over the sudden, suffocating silence of the patio. He looked directly into my eyes and asked if these individuals were causing a disturbance on my property, ma'am. The entire terrace froze. The music seemed to fade into a dull hum. Brenda's jaw went completely slack, her arm falling limply to her side as the guard's words slowly processed in her mind. Maya let out a small, confused squeak, looking wildly between the massive security chief and my cold, unblinking face. Behind them, the crowd parted slightly. Judge Arthur Thornton and his wife Eleanor slowly turned around, their expressions morphing from polite detachment to absolute unadulterated confusion. They stared at Connor, who was now visibly trembling, and then looked toward me, the woman the head of security had just addressed, as the sole owner of the Sterling estate. The beautiful, opulent stage Brenda and Maya had stolen so much money to build was officially set, and the spotlight was finally burning exactly where it belonged. The sheer absurdity of the moment hung in the humid night air, freezing the entire patio in a tableau of absolute shock. Judge Arthur Thornton's silver eyebrows knit together in profound, deeply offended confusion. He looked at the massive security chief, then at Brenda, and finally at me. Eleanor Thornton actually took a physical step backward, her heavy diamond necklace catching the ambient glow of the fairy lights as her hand flew to her chest. Brenda remained completely paralyzed, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, unable to formulate a single coherent syllable. Maya's rapid, panicked hyperventilation was the only sound breaking the immediate tension, her chest heaving violently under her custom silk gown. I did not dignify their shock with an immediate response. I simply nodded to Marcus silently, signaling him to stand down but remain close. I stepped around my mother, entirely ignoring her pathetic, trembling existence, and walked purposefully toward the elevated stone terrace where the DJ had set up his extensive audio equipment. Julian walked a half step behind my right shoulder, projecting an aura of absolute, unwavering protection. Auntie Vivian flanked my left, her chin held high, radiating the fierce, untouchable pride of our ancestors. The sea of wealthy, arrogant guests parted instantly. The old money corporate executives and judgmental socialites who had spent the evening looking down their noses at my family instinctively stepped aside, murmuring to one another as they took in my unapologetic, commanding stride. The string quartet had mercifully stopped playing a few moments prior, leaving only the low, generic thumping of an instrumental ambient track coming from the DJ's massive speakers. I reached the booth. The DJ, a young guy in a trendy metallic suit, looked absolutely terrified as my security personnel formed a perimeter around the elevated platform. I reached over the turntable console, locked my fingers onto the master volume slider, and dragged it straight down to 0. The heavy bass track died instantly. The silence that blanketed the Sterling estate was absolute and suffocating. It was the sound of a carefully constructed lie preparing to shatter. I picked up the sleek silver microphone resting on the console. I flicked the power switch and tapped the top mesh twice. The sharp metallic thud echoed perfectly across the manicured lawns, bouncing off the historic brick facade of the main house. Every single face in the crowd was turned toward the terrace, their eyes locked onto me. I looked directly into the center of the crowd, bypassing the wide-eyed corporate executives and whispering socialites, and locked eyes directly with Connor's parents. I spoke with perfect crystalline diction, my voice a freezing clinical wave that washed over the manicured gardens. I welcomed everyone to the Sterling estate. I told them I sincerely hoped they were thoroughly enjoying the vintage champagne and the imported caviar that had been so meticulously selected for this evening. I kept my posture perfectly straight, letting the weight of my tailored midnight blue suit and my absolute composure command the physical space. I informed the elite crowd that there seemed to be a massive systemic misunderstanding regarding my identity and my presence at this event. I told them that for the past 2 years, my sister and her fiancé had actively cultivated a false narrative, painting me to their social circle as a bitter, underachieving dropout who was simply too jealous to participate in their high society fairy tale. I let a sharp, humorless smile cross my face. I introduced myself properly. I stated my full name loud and clear. I announced that I was not a jealous spectator crashing a party, but the founder and chief executive officer of Sterling Holdings. I watched as the color rapidly drained from Judge Thornton's face. I took a slow, deliberate breath and delivered the ultimate checkmate. I informed the entire assembly that Sterling Holdings was the sole legal owner of the magnificent estate they were currently standing on. I told them this was my property, my land, my venue. The collective gasp from the crowd was audible. A wave of frantic, hushed whispers immediately erupted among the black-tie guests. They looked around at the opulent surroundings, the thousands of twinkling fairy lights, the massive floral installations, and suddenly realized they were standing inside my personal corporate domain. Maya snapped out of her paralyzed stupor. The sheer humiliation of being exposed in front of Connor's elite family broke whatever fragile tether to reality she had left. She let out a piercing, unhinged scream and charged toward the stone terrace. She hiked up the heavy skirt of her expensive gown, stomping up the stone steps with absolute irrational fury. Brenda followed closely behind her, face contorted in a desperate panic, trying to physically hold Maya back but failing miserably. Maya reached the top of the terrace, her chest heaving, tears of furious denial streaking her flawless, professionally applied makeup. She pointed a trembling finger at me and screamed to the crowd that I was a pathological liar. She frantically reached into her heavily beaded designer clutch and pulled out a thick folded stack of papers. She waved the document frantically in the air, the pages rustling loudly in the microphone's pickup. She shrieked that she had the official venue contract right in her hand. She yelled that it was printed on official Sterling Estate letterhead, legally binding her and Connor to the property for the entire weekend. She demanded that my own security staff arrest me for trespassing and defamation. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I kept the microphone perfectly level and looked at the crumpled papers in her hand with absolute unadulterated disdain. I smiled, letting the coldness reach my eyes, and advised my sister to read the fine print of that supposedly ironclad contract. I informed her and the captive audience, hanging on my every word, that standard commercial leasing agreements contain very specific, non-negotiable clauses regarding the legality of the funds used to secure the property. I kept my voice steady, projecting clinical legal authority over the entire lawn. I revealed that the $100,000 deposit used to secure the Sterling estate had been fraudulently transferred from a protected family trust. I detailed exactly how Brenda had forged my signature on federal banking documents to steal my rightful inheritance to fund this ridiculous, pathetic charade. I turned my gaze back to Judge Thornton, letting the legal reality of my words sink into his experienced mind. I announced that because the funds were obtained through federal wire fraud and grand larceny, the contract Maya was waving around so proudly was entirely null and void. I told the crowd they were not attending an elite wedding rehearsal. They were standing in the middle of an active crime scene, and the hosts were corporate trespassers. The societal elite in the crowd were entirely scandalized. The whispers grew into loud, highly judgmental declarations. The very people Maya had tried so desperately to impress were now looking at her like she was a common thief. Judge Arthur Thornton pushed his way to the front of the crowd, his face an apoplectic shade of crimson. He looked at Connor, his voice booming with decades of courtroom authority, demanding to know if this woman was telling the truth. He demanded to know if his son was funding a wedding with stolen money. Connor opened his mouth, but only a pathetic strangled wheeze came out. He looked at his father, then at the ground, visibly shaking in his custom tuxedo. Brenda fell to her knees on the grass, sobbing hysterically, begging the judge to understand that she was just trying to help the young couple start their life together. Maya was completely unraveling, tearing at the edges of the contract in her hands, screaming that I had ruined her life, that I had set her up, that I was a monster. I let them spiral for a few moments, letting the absolute destruction of their toxic facade burn into their memories. But I was not finished. I did not come here to just cancel a venue contract. I came here to perform a complete structural demolition of the lies they had built their lives upon. I lowered the microphone and reached into the inside breast pocket of my tailored blazer. I pulled out a sleek black remote control. I looked down at Maya, who was still weeping on the stone steps, and told her that her beautiful rehearsal dinner montage was ready to begin. I pointed the remote directly at the massive high-definition outdoor LED screens that Maya had rented for $5,000 to play a romantic slideshow of her and Connor's relationship. I pressed the power button. The massive screens flickered to life, bathing the manicured lawn in a stark, glaring white light. But it was not a slideshow of the happy couple. The crowd went completely silent once again, every single eye locked onto the towering screens as the true depth of Connor and Maya's deception was broadcast in spectacular, undeniable high definition. The massive outdoor LED screens, originally intended to broadcast Maya and Connor's fabricated love story, illuminated the night with a harsh, unforgiving white glare. The crisp, high-definition display did not show photos of the couple vacationing in the Hamptons or sipping champagne on a chartered yacht. Instead, it projected a highly magnified, unredacted legal document. The bold black lettering at the very top of the page was impossible to misinterpret or ignore. United States Bankruptcy Court. Chapter 11. Voluntary Petition. The name listed as the primary debtor was not some anonymous corporation. It was Connor's heavily leveraged tech firm, followed immediately by his own name, as the personal guarantor of tens of millions in defaulted loans. The screen detailed the crushing liabilities, the frantic restructuring attempts, and the undeniable reality of his complete financial ruin. He was not a tech prodigy. He was a sinking ship. A collective, breathless gasp rippled through the sea of black tie guests. The silence that followed was so absolute you could hear the gentle rustle of the oak leaves in the evening breeze. I kept my eyes locked on Judge Arthur Thornton. The color drained entirely from his stern, aristocratic face, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. The heavy crystal tumbler of vintage bourbon he was holding slipped from his paralyzed fingers. It hit the stone patio with a sharp, violent crack, sending shards of glass and amber liquid splashing across his polished leather shoes. He did not even flinch. He just stared at the screen, watching his family's pristine legacy crumble in front of his eyes. Connor let out a pathetic strangled noise, a sound caught somewhere between a sob and a cough. He lunged toward the DJ booth, his hands outstretched, begging someone to cut the power to the displays. Julian simply took a single deliberate step forward, crossing his muscular arms over his chest. The sheer intimidation radiating from Julian's imposing frame stopped Connor dead in his tracks. Connor shrank back, a cornered rat trapped in the blinding spotlight of his own catastrophic failures. I did not give them a moment to breathe. I did not give them a second to formulate an excuse or spin a desperate lie. I pressed the button on the sleek black remote a second time. The screen transitioned seamlessly to the next slide. This was not a public court filing. This was intimately, devastatingly personal. The high-definition display now showed a series of side-by-side bank statements and wire transfer logs. On the left side of the screen were the immaculate, legally protected records of my late grandmother's sacred trust account. On the right side were Connor's personal and corporate checking accounts. Highlighted in bright, undeniable yellow were the massive six-figure transfers moving directly from the trust into Connor's possession over the past 3 months. But the most damning evidence was displayed right in the center. I had projected a highly magnified image of the authorization forms required to break the trust. I placed Brenda's actual verified signature right next to the clumsy, rushed forgery she had submitted to the bank. The discrepancy was glaring, amateurish, and completely undeniable. It was not a clerical error. It was a calculated, deliberate felony. I pressed the button once more, bringing up the final fatal slide. It was a meticulously itemized ledger tracing exactly where my grandmother's stolen life savings had gone. The crowd of elite socialites leaned in, their eyes widening in absolute horror as they read the breakdown. The imported beluga caviar they were currently eating, the vintage champagne they were drinking, the massive imported floral arches surrounding them, the non-refundable deposit for this very estate, even the lease payments for the luxury sports car Connor had parked so conspicuously near the entrance. Every single luxury they had been flaunting was paid for with stolen money. Maya was trembling violently, her eyes darting frantically around the crowd, searching for a single sympathetic face. She found none. The wealthy, judgmental friends she had tried so aggressively to court were now looking at her with a mixture of profound disgust and overwhelming pity. They were actively stepping away from her, pulling their designer gowns and tailored suits back, as if her fraud was a highly contagious disease. Brenda was still on her knees on the grass, her heavily sequined dress catching the harsh light of the screens. She was weeping loudly, burying her face in her hands, completely unable to witness the absolute destruction of her social climbing ambitions. She had traded her mother's legacy for a seat at this table, and I had just flipped the table over. I raised the microphone to my lips, my voice cut through the tense, suffocated air with the precision of a surgical scalpel. "Welcome to the Sterling Estate," I announced, letting the sheer undeniable authority of my position resonate across the manicured lawns. "I sincerely apologize for the disruption to your evening. However, as the legal owner of this commercial property, I cannot allow it to be used as a staging ground for federal wire fraud." I paused, letting my gaze sweep over the terrified faces of my so-called family. "Unfortunately, the lavish event you are attending tonight is being hosted by a bankrupt fraudster and entirely funded by a stolen inheritance. The food, the drinks, the decorations, and the illusion of immense wealth you have been sold are all the direct products of grand larceny. I looked directly at Maya, who was now weeping openly. Her flawless, professionally applied makeup was running down her face, in dark, ugly streaks staining her custom silk gown. She opened her mouth to speak, to beg, to hurl another useless insult, but no sound came out. The crushing reality of her situation had finally broken through her massive delusions. Because the contract securing this venue was signed using stolen funds, I continued, my tone shifting from informative to absolute unyielding command. That agreement is legally null and void. Therefore, this gathering is now officially classified as an unauthorized trespass on private corporate property. I checked the sleek silver watch on my wrist, a deliberate, highly visible movement designed to emphasize the finality of my words. You all have exactly 10 minutes to vacate my property. After that, my security team will begin physically escorting individuals to the front gates, and the local authorities will be contacted to deal with the primary instigators of this fraud. I lowered the microphone. The execution was complete. For 3 agonizing seconds, no one moved. The crowd was utterly paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the scandal they had just witnessed. It was a level of public humiliation that these high society families had never encountered. Then the silence was shattered by a sound so sharp and violent it echoed off the brick facade of the estate. Eleanor Thornton. Connor's mother had moved with terrifying predatory speed. She closed the distance between herself and her son in 3 long strides. She did not yell. She did not weep. She raised her hand, weighed down by heavy generational diamond rings, and slapped Connor across the face with every ounce of strength she possessed. The loud crack of the impact made several people gasp. Connor stumbled backward, clutching his rapidly reddening cheek, his eyes wide with profound shock and fear. "You absolute disgrace," Eleanor hissed. Her voice vibrated with a cold, aristocratic fury that made Brenda's earlier screaming seem like a pathetic joke. "You looked us in the eye and lied. You dragged our family name into the mud for this pathetic, fraudulent circus." Judge Thornton stepped up beside his wife, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. He did not even look at Connor. He looked directly at me, giving a tight, formal nod of acknowledgement. It was a silent concession of my victory and his son's absolute failure. Then he turned to his wife, offered his arm, and began walking purposefully toward the main exit. The spell was permanently broken. The elite crowd immediately snapped into action. They did not walk. They practically sprinted toward the valet station. The wealthy socialites abandoned their expensive hors d'oeuvres and dropped their crystal champagne flutes onto the grass. They were scrambling to distance themselves from Connor and Maya, terrified that the stench of bankruptcy and federal fraud would ruin their own reputations. Maya snapped out of her shock. She lunged forward, trying to grab Eleanor Thornton's arm as the older woman turned to follow her husband. Maya was sobbing uncontrollably, pleading with her prospective mother-in-law, begging her to understand that they could fix this, that they could still be a prominent family. Eleanor stopped. She looked down at Maya's desperate, clinging hand as if it were a piece of rotting garbage. She yanked her arm free with violent disgust. "Do not touch me," Eleanor commanded, her voice dripping with venom. "You and your mother are nothing but common thieves playing dress-up. The wedding is permanently canceled. If you or your son ever attempt to contact my family again, I will ensure you spend the rest of your miserable lives in a federal penitentiary." Eleanor turned and walked away, leaving Maya completely shattered on the stone patio. The illusion of the golden couple, the fantasy of old money elevation, the arrogant certainty that they had defeated me was all gone. It had been completely incinerated in less than 5 minutes. I stood calmly by the DJ booth, watching the mass exodus of high society. Auntie Vivian stepped up beside me, a deeply satisfied smile playing on her lips. She watched Brenda sobbing on the grass, entirely abandoned by the crowd she had sacrificed her own mother's legacy to impress. "Grandma would be proud of you, Chloe," Auntie Vivian murmured quietly, her eyes never leaving Brenda's pathetic, crumbling figure. Julian wrapped his arm around my waist, pulling me close. The warmth of his presence grounded me, reminding me that while I had just burned my past to the ground, my future was standing right beside me, completely untouched by the flames. 10 minutes, Julian noted, checking his own watch. "They are moving fast." They always do when the money runs out, I replied, my voice steady and cold. I watched Connor drop to his knees next to Maya, both of them weeping in the absolute wreckage of their stolen dream. The fairy lights above them suddenly flickered and died, cut off by my security team. The Sterling estate was plunging into darkness, leaving them with nothing but the glaring, unforgiving light of the evidence screen, projecting their crimes into the night. The mass exodus from the Sterling estate was swift, chaotic, and entirely devoid of the high society grace these people usually prided themselves on. The sudden plunge into darkness, save for the glaring, clinical white light radiating from the massive LED screens, projecting Connor's bankruptcy and Brenda's felony forgery, acted as a starting gun. The elite guests scrambled. I watched as Judge Arthur Thornton pulled a sleek black phone from his tuxedo pocket. He did not yell, but his clipped, furious tone carried across the rapidly emptying terrace. He barked a single command to his private detail. Within seconds, a fleet of heavily armored black SUVs roared up the sweeping gravel driveway, completely ignoring the designated valet lanes. The tires kicked up dust and crushed the delicate imported orchids lining the path. Connor, still reeling from the violent slap his mother had delivered, watched his family's motorcade arrive, the paralyzing shock that had anchored him to the stone patio finally shattered, replaced by a raw, primal panic. He realized exactly what was happening. His parents were not just leaving the rehearsal dinner, they were cutting him off. The Bank of Thornton, the prestigious family name, and the final shreds of his unearned social currency were being permanently revoked. He scrambled to his feet, his custom tuxedo pants scraping against the rough stone. He lunged forward, sprinting toward the lead SUV where his father was already stepping into the back seat. Connor reached out his hand, grasping for the heavy door handle, shouting his father's name, begging for a single minute to explain. He never made it. A massive, broad-shouldered bodyguard stepped out of the shadows, planting a firm, unforgiving hand squarely in the center of Connor's chest. The guard shoved him backward with enough force to send Connor stumbling over his own feet. Judge Thornton did not even glance out the tinted window. The heavy door slammed shut with a definitive hollow thud, and the entire fleet of SUVs accelerated down the driveway, leaving Connor choking on their exhaust fumes. The rejection was absolute, public, and devastating. Connor stood in the driveway for a long moment, his chest heaving as the red taillights disappeared through the iron gates. Then he slowly turned around. The sheer terror on his face had vanished violently, transforming into pure, unadulterated rage. His jaw was clenched so tightly, a muscle twitched visibly in his cheek. He needed a scapegoat. He needed someone to absorb the catastrophic fallout of his own pathetic failures, and his eyes locked directly onto Maya. Maya was still sitting on the damp grass near the terrace steps, weeping uncontrollably. Her hands were buried in her face, and her perfectly styled hair was beginning to unravel in the humid night air. Connor did not walk toward her. He marched. He closed the distance between them, grabbed her roughly by the upper arm, and hauled her to her feet like a rag doll. Maya let out a sharp cry of pain, but Connor completely ignored it. In front of the remaining catering staff, my personal security team, Julian, Auntie Vivian, and me, Connor, unleashed a verbal assault so vicious it made the cold night air feel actively toxic. He pointed a shaking finger directly at the glowing LED screens projecting Brenda's forged documents and screamed at Maya at the top of his lungs. He demanded to know if this was the generational wealth she had promised him. He yelled that she had looked him in the eye for 2 years and sworn her family had deep, untouchable old money. She had promised him that the trust fund was entirely hers, that she had millions in liquid assets just waiting to be deployed to bail out his failing tech company. Maya tried to speak, choking on her own sobs, shaking her head frantically in denial, but Connor cut her off with a brutal, barking laugh. He called her a cheap, pathetic fraud. He screamed that she was nothing but a middle-class grifter who had played him for a fool. He systematically dismantled her entire ego loudly, declaring that he had never actually loved her. He stated with chilling, ruthless clarity that the only reason he ever looked twice at a nobody like her was for the capital she had promised to inject into his dying business. He told her that her fake high society accent, her desperate need for designer labels, and her entire existence were a repulsive manufactured joke. He yelled that she had cost him, his family, his remaining dignity, and his last chance at financial survival. Maya broke completely. The illusion she had sacrificed everything to build was being violently torn apart by the very man she had stolen to impress. The fairy tale was dead, and the corpse was rotting right in front of her. She cried hysterically, the sound sharp and guttural. Thick black mascara ran down her cheeks in heavy streaks, dripping onto the bodice of her custom-stolen designer gown, ruining the expensive silk. She abandoned all remaining pride and threw herself at Connor. She clung to the lapels of his tuxedo, her knuckles white, sobbing and begging him not to leave her. She pleaded with him, her voice cracking as she promised they could still fix this. She babbled absolute delusions, swearing that her mother could find another way, that Brenda could get more money, that they could run away and start over. She begged him to remember that they were the golden couple, that they were meant to rule this city together. Connor looked at her with an expression of pure, unvarnished repulsion. He did not see a fiancé. He saw a parasite that had drained him dry. He brought his hands up and physically pried her desperate, clinging fingers off his jacket. With a sharp, aggressive motion, he shoved her backward. Maya lost her footing in her 6-inch designer heels. Her ankles twisted and she fell hard backward, hitting the solid stone patio with a heavy, sickening thud. The breath was knocked out of her lungs and she lay there a crumpled, sobbing heap of ruined silk and shattered delusions. Connor did not even flinch. He did not ask if she was hurt. He did not look back. He simply adjusted his ruined tuxedo jacket, stepped casually over her sprawling legs, and broke into a full sprint down the dark driveway. He abandoned his bride at the altar of her own destroyed rehearsal dinner, chasing desperately after the fading taillights of a family that had already erased him from their legacy. The heavy, suffocating silence returned to the Sterling estate. The caterers had vanished into the kitchens. The remaining stragglers had fled. There was only the low hum of the generator powering the LED screens, casting their harsh white light over the wreckage of my family. Brenda had watched the entire implosion from the grass. She had witnessed Connor's brutal verbal dissection of her favorite daughter. She had watched the wealthy elite run from her like she was a walking plague. The magnificent, highly calculated societal climb she had dedicated her life to orchestrating, the climb she had eagerly committed federal crimes to achieve, had evaporated into thin air in less than 20 minutes. The adrenaline and the furious, arrogant energy that had sustained my mother for decades simply vanished. She collapsed entirely. Her legs gave out, and she dropped heavily to her knees on the damp, manicured lawn. The heavy sequins of her inappropriate evening gown dug into the dirt. She looked small, hollow, and utterly pathetic. Slowly, agonizingly, Brenda raised her head. The heavy theatrical makeup she wore was smeared across her face. Tears streamed continuously from her eyes, carving clean tracks through the foundation. She looked up at me. I stood on the elevated terrace, bathed in the glow of the screens, Julian's warm hand resting steadily on the small of my back, Auntie Vivian standing tall and righteous at my side. I did not look angry. I did not look sad. I looked down at the woman who gave birth to me with the cold, clinical detachment of a scientist observing an insect under a microscope. Brenda's eyes locked onto mine, and the very last remnants of her arrogance completely dissolved, the reality of the Chapter 11 bankruptcy filing the undeniable proof of her forged signatures and the absolute certainty of an incoming federal indictment crashed down upon her. She stopped looking at me as the bitter, jealous older sister she could endlessly bully. The terror radiating from her face was profound and absolute. She finally realized that I was not a victim. I was the architect of her destruction. She stared up at the apex predator who had quietly, systematically, and flawlessly dismantled her entire existence, and she knew with absolute certainty that she had messed with the wrong woman. The heavy, suffocating silence that descended upon the Sterling estate was absolute. The string quartet had long since packed away their instruments and fled. The catering staff, recognizing the volatile and legally perilous nature of the situation, had quietly vanished into the service corridors of the main house. The manicured lawns, which only 20 minutes prior had been swarming with local aristocrats and corporate titans, were now completely deserted. Dozens of half-empty crystal champagne flutes lay discarded in the grass. Exquisite silver trays of imported hors d'oeuvres sat abandoned on the high-top cocktail tables. The only source of illumination on the grand stone terrace was the harsh, unforgiving white glare of the massive outdoor LED screens, which were still actively projecting the undeniable evidence of Connor's Chapter 11 bankruptcy and Brenda's federal wire fraud into the cool night air. Brenda remained exactly where she had collapsed. She was a crumpled, trembling heap of sequins and dirt. The glittering, overly expensive evening gown she had purchased specifically to conquer high society was now smeared with damp earth and grass stains. The adrenaline and the furious, arrogant energy that had fueled her relentless social climbing for decades had simply evaporated. She realized with a terrifying and paralyzing clarity that the federal fraud evidence displayed on the massive screens behind me was not an idle threat. It was a concrete, unavoidable promise. The reality of her actions finally broke through her impenetrable wall of narcissistic delusion. Brenda did not stand up. Her legs completely refused to support her weight. Instead, she began to crawl. She dragged her knees across the damp lawn, moving awkwardly toward the edge of the elevated stone terrace where I stood. It was a pathetic, agonizingly slow display. This was the woman who had spent my entire life looking down on me, telling me I was unrefined, unlovable, and destined to be a bitter failure. Now she was physically dragging herself through the mud to reach my feet. She reached the bottom of the stone steps. Her trembling hands shot forward, her perfectly manicured fingers curling desperately around the hem of my tailored midnight blue trousers. She gripped the fabric of my suit like a drowning woman clinging to a life raft in a hurricane. Her voice was entirely unrecognizable. The arrogant, booming tone she used to command attention and belittle retail workers had been replaced by a shrill, frantic wail. She begged me to stop the impending lawsuit. She screamed that she could not survive a federal courtroom. She sobbed so hard her breath hitched in her throat, crying that the banking investigators would lock her away and that she would die in a federal prison for wire fraud. Her tears soaked into the hem of my pants, but I did not step back. I stood perfectly still, allowing her to feel the absolute immovability of the mountain she had foolishly crashed into. Brenda babbled wildly about the family home in the suburbs. She wailed that if the authorities seized her assets to repay the stolen trust fund, she would lose the house she had fought so hard to keep. She cried that she would be thrown out onto the street with absolutely nothing, completely disgraced in front of her neighbors and the entire town. She begged me to call off my corporate lawyers to erase the digital files and to just let her quietly return the money over time. She promised she would pay me back every single cent. She swore she would take a second job, sell her jewelry, and do whatever it took as long as I kept her out of a prison cell. I did not say a word. My silence acted as a vacuum, sucking the oxygen out of her desperate, impossible promises. Julian stood slightly behind me, a silent, imposing sentinel, while Auntie Vivian watched Brenda's humiliation with a deeply satisfied, righteous gaze. Brenda looked up at me, her eyes bloodshot and wild. She saw that her frantic begging was having absolutely zero effect on my demeanor. Panic gave way to her oldest, most deeply ingrained reflex. When pleading failed, Brenda always resorted to emotional manipulation. She released her tight grip on my trousers and slapped her hands aggressively against her own chest, invoking the sacred, unassailable shield of motherhood. She attempted to weaponize our biology. Her voice grew louder, laced with a toxic, manufactured, righteous indignation. She demanded to know how I could do this to my own mother. She screamed that we were blood, that family was supposed to unconditionally protect each other, not destroy each other in front of a crowd of wealthy strangers. She pointed a shaking, accusing finger at my face, desperately trying to flip the narrative. She tried to cast me as the cold, heartless corporate villain who was ruthlessly executing her own flesh and blood for the sake of $1. Brenda yelled that money had changed me. She cried that my sudden massive wealth had turned me into a vindictive monster who cared more about property than people. She told me that I had forgotten where I came from, that I was cruelly discarding the woman who had given me life just to prove a petty point. She wailed that I had completely forgotten my roots. I looked down at her. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel a shred of daughterly guilt. I looked at her with the absolute freezing indifference of a judge delivering a mandatory, inescapable sentence. I let her manipulative words hang in the cool night air, allowing the sheer staggering hypocrisy of her statements to settle over the empty terrace. I spoke quietly, my voice slicing through her manufactured hysteria with surgical precision. I told her that she had permanently lost the right to invoke the title of mother the very moment she decided my future was a disposable slush fund for her favorite child. I reminded her that she had never once protected me. Not when Maya destroyed my childhood belongings, not when Maya spread vicious reputation-ruining rumors about me in high school, and certainly not when Maya needed 6 figures in stolen cash to trap a bankrupt fraudster. I kept my posture rigid, looking directly into her panicked, tear-filled eyes. I told Brenda that she had actively used my ambition, my sleepless nights, and my relentless hard work as nothing more than a convenient stepping stone for Maya's extreme entitlement. She had viewed my hard-earned success merely as a financial resource to be harvested for her own pathetic social climbing. I leaned forward slightly, bringing my face closer to hers, ensuring she heard and absorbed every single syllable of my verdict. I told her I was not forgetting my roots, Brenda. I told her I was pulling the weeds. Brenda let out a sharp, devastated gasp, violently recoiling as if I had physically struck her across the face. She slumped back onto the wet grass, completely broken, the fight entirely drained from her trembling body. She stared at the dirt, finally understanding the absolute finality of her ruin. But the chaotic spectacle on the terrace was not quite over. To my right, a frantic rustling of heavy silk drew my attention. Maya was desperately scrambling across the stone patio. She had managed to push herself up from where Connor had shoved her to the ground, but she was a complete, horrifying disaster. Her designer rehearsal gown, the dress paid for with my grandmother's stolen life savings, was torn at the side seam. Thick black streams of waterproof mascara ran down her pale cheeks, and her elaborate, expensive updo had completely collapsed, leaving tangled strands of hair plastered to her wet face. She did not look angry anymore. She looked utterly deranged. The harsh reality of Connor physically abandoning her, combined with the total, unrecoverable destruction of her social standing, had completely fractured her fragile mind. She lunged forward, her hands grasping frantically for my wrist. I did not pull away. I let her grab my hand, her fingers icy and shaking violently against my skin. She looked up at me with wide, manic eyes, playing the ultimate victim card one final pathetic time. She completely ignored the fact that her fiancé was a bankrupt, heavily leveraged liar who had just publicly humiliated her and fled the property. She ignored the massive federal crimes her mother had committed to fund this party. In her highly fractured delusional reality, there was only one single thing that mattered: the image, the event. Maya choked on a heavy sob, her grip on my hand tightening painfully. She begged me. She called me her big sister, a title she had historically used only as a condescending insult. She pleaded with me, her voice a fragile, hysterical whisper that bordered on madness. She told me I had to let her have the wedding tomorrow. She cried that the wealthy guests would come back, that they could still salvage the reception, that she could still be a beautiful, wealthy bride if I just let them use the estate. She stared at me with pure, unhinged desperation and wailed that I had to give her the venue because she had absolutely nothing left. I looked down at her trembling, manicured fingers digging into my skin. There was no pity left in me. I calmly and deliberately reached down, peeled her cold hands off my wrist, and took a single step back. My voice was a flat, unyielding line. I told her to go find another venue, because this one was for family, not thieves. Maya let out a hollow gasp. The words struck her with physical force. She slumped forward onto the stone patio, her forehead resting against the cold slate, as she finally surrendered to the undeniable reality of her ruin. I raised my hand and gave a sharp, definitive nod to Marcus. My security chief immediately tapped his earpiece, speaking a rapid command. Within seconds, a dozen uniformed security personnel materialized from the shadows of the estate. They moved with absolute military precision. 2 guards approached Maya, gripping her firmly by the upper arms and hauling her to her feet. She did not fight them. She was entirely limp, a hollow shell of the arrogant bride-to-be who had strutted onto my property hours earlier. Two more guards flanked Brenda. My mother did not even try to stand on her own. They had to physically lift her from the damp grass. She stared blankly ahead, her eyes vacant, completely shattered by the absolute loss of her social standing and the looming threat of federal prison. As they marched my mother and sister down the sweeping gravel driveway toward the exit, the true dismantling of their fraudulent fairy tale began. I watched as the catering manager, realizing the deposit was paid with stolen funds and the event was over, signaled his team. The waitstaff moved rapidly, stripping the crisp white linens from the cocktail tables and boxing up the imported caviar and expensive hors d'oeuvres. The floral team, who had been waiting on standby, began ruthlessly tearing down the massive imported silk flower arches Maya had demanded. The thousands of twinkling fairy lights were unceremoniously unplugged and spooled into heavy black plastic bins. The opulent stolen dream was being erased, packed into the back of idling delivery trucks. I stood perfectly still on the terrace, watching the methodical efficiency of the teardown. The loud clatter of folding chairs and the heavy thuds of equipment cases being loaded echoed across the lawns. It was the sound of my past being aggressively boxed up and shipped away. Down at the main gates, Brenda and Maya were unceremoniously deposited onto the public sidewalk. A lone generic rideshare vehicle pulled up to the curb, a stark, humiliating contrast to the fleet of luxury SUVs that had transported Connor's family. The guards watched as my mother and sister climbed into the back of the battered sedan. I kept my eyes fixed on the driveway until the dim red taillights of their car faded completely into the dark, swallowed by the night, and permanently exiled from my life. The heavy delivery truck soon followed, rolling out through the wrought iron gates. The heavy metal doors swung shut with a resounding metallic clang, the electronic locks engaged, securing the perimeter. The Sterling estate fell into a profound, immaculate silence. The chaotic energy, the toxic manipulation, and the suffocating presence of my former family were completely gone. The crisp night air suddenly felt lighter, easier to breathe. Auntie Vivian walked up beside me. The fierce protective fire in her eyes had softened into a deep, radiant warmth. She reached out and placed a gentle, steadying hand on my shoulder. She looked around at the pristine, empty lawns, and then she looked directly into my eyes. Her voice was thick with emotion, rich with the history of our ancestors, and the undeniable triumph of this moment. She told me that my grandmother would be incredibly proud of the woman I had become. She said that my grandmother had always known I possessed a spine of pure steel, and tonight I had honored her legacy by protecting it. I felt a single hot tear escape my eye, tracing a path down my cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow, but of absolute, overwhelming release. I placed my hand over Auntie Vivian's, squeezing it tightly, silently, thanking her for being the only true family I had ever known on that side of my bloodline. Julian stepped up behind me, wrapping his strong, muscular arms around my waist. He pulled me back against his solid chest, resting his chin gently on the top of my head. The steady rhythm of his heartbeat against my spine grounded me, washing away the last lingering traces of adrenaline. He looked out over the expansive, flawlessly manicured grounds of my property. A slow, knowing smile spread across his handsome face. He kissed my temple and asked if the venue was officially clear for next Saturday. I leaned back into his embrace, turning my head to look up at the man who had stood by me, believed in me, and helped me build an empire from the ashes of my childhood. I looked out at my pristine estate, truly mine in every sense of the word. I smiled, the feeling reaching all the way to my soul, and told him it was perfectly clear. 2 weeks later, the Sterling estate was transformed once again. But this time, there were no stolen funds, no fraudulent contracts, and absolutely no toxic family members lurking in the shadows. The property radiated genuine, unadulterated joy. The late afternoon sun bathed the historic brick facade in a warm golden glow, and the gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh ocean air and sweet jasmine. This was my actual wedding day. The setup was flawless and breathtakingly elegant. Hundreds of delicate ivory roses lined the stone pathway leading to the main terrace. A string quartet played a soft, beautiful melody that floated harmoniously over the manicured lawns. But the most significant difference was not the floral arrangements or the music. It was the people. Every single guest seated on the pristine white chairs was someone who genuinely loved, respected, and supported us. There were our loyal corporate partners, the friends who had held me together during the lean startup years, and Julian's warm, welcoming family who had embraced me as their own from the very first day. Sitting in the very front row wearing a magnificent emerald green dress and a hat that demanded respect was Auntie Vivian. She was beaming with a pride so fierce it practically illuminated the space around her. I walked down the aisle in a custom-tailored gown that fit me like a second skin, completely unbothered by the ghosts of my past. Julian stood at the altar, looking devastatingly handsome in his sharp black tuxedo. His eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my heart race. There was no anxiety, no waiting for the other shoe to drop, no bracing for a cruel comment from my mother or a jealous sneer from my sister. The air was entirely pure. The vows we exchanged were promises of equal partnership, mutual respect, and an unbreakable bond forged in reality, not delusion. While we celebrated our union surrounded by authentic love, the legal and financial sledgehammers I had swung 2 weeks prior were systematically demolishing the lives of the people who had tried to destroy me. The consequences had manifested with ruthless, spectacular efficiency. Brenda's world had completely caved in. The bank presented with the undeniable proof of her forged signatures and unauthorized wire transfers had moved swiftly and aggressively. She was officially indicted for multiple counts of felony wire fraud and grand larceny. To avoid immediate incarceration while awaiting trial, and to begin paying the massive court-ordered restitution to my grandmother's trust, Brenda was forced to put her beloved suburban home on the market. The sprawling house she had prized as her ultimate status symbol was sold at a heavy loss in a desperate fire sale. The neighbors she had spent decades trying to impress watched from their pristine lawns as movers packed her belongings into a discount moving truck. She was moving into a cramped one-bedroom rental on the outskirts of the city, stripped of her assets, her reputation, and her false dignity. Maya's reality was equally grim. The illusion of her high society destiny had vanished, leaving her with absolutely zero marketable skills and a mountain of personal credit card debt she had accumulated trying to keep up with Connor's elite social circle. With Brenda's funds seized and her own reputation toxic in the corporate world, Maya was forced into the only employment she could find. She was currently working a minimum-wage retail job at a mid-tier suburban mall. She spent her days folding cheap sweaters and taking orders from teenage managers. Her bare hands a constant reminder of the massive diamond engagement ring she no longer possessed. Connor predictably had completely cut all ties with her the moment he fled the estate. He had dumped her via a cowardly 2-sentence text message the following morning, blocking her number immediately afterward. However, abandoning Maya did not save him. His Chapter 11. Bankruptcy was only the beginning of his nightmare. The financial auditors tearing through his tech firm's ledgers had discovered massive systemic discrepancies. He was currently facing his own severe embezzlement charges, his wealthy parents having entirely made good on their promise to cut him off. He was fighting federal prosecutors with a court-appointed public defender, his luxury sports cars repossessed, and his golden boy image permanently destroyed. I did not need to watch their downfalls on the evening news to feel satisfied. I did not need to drive past Brenda's sold house or visit Maya's retail job to gloat. Their misery was simply background noise, irrelevant static in a world I no longer inhabited. I was sitting on a sun-drenched, whitewashed balcony overlooking the impossibly blue caldera of Santorini. The Aegean Sea sparkled like crushed diamonds under the Mediterranean sun. A warm, salty breeze rustled the sheer white curtains of our luxury honeymoon suite. Julian sat across from me at a small wrought iron table, pouring crisp, chilled champagne into 2 crystal flutes. He handed me a glass, his fingers brushing gently against mine, his eyes full of absolute adoration and peace. I took a slow sip of the champagne, the cold, crisp liquid perfectly matching the clarity of the moment. I leaned back in my chair and looked out at the vast, endless expanse of the ocean. For years, I had believed that success would be my armor. I had thought that building a massive corporate empire and accumulating wealth would serve as an impenetrable shield against my family's relentless cruelty. I had anticipated the moment of the reveal, imagining the satisfying shock on their faces when they realized the dropout they despised was actually a titan of industry. And the reveal had been satisfying. The public exposure of their fraud, the complete dismantling of their arrogant facades, the swift and brutal legal consequences, it had all been executed with flawless precision. But as I sat there miles away from the wreckage of my past, feeling the Mediterranean sun warm my skin, I realized I had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of my victory. The best revenge was not the highly orchestrated public exposure. It was not the dramatic reclaiming of my property, or the satisfaction of watching Brenda and Maya lose everything they had stolen and lied to obtain. The vindication of their financial and social ruin was just a preliminary step, a necessary clearing of the debris. The true revenge, the ultimate unassailable triumph, was the profound absolute silence they left behind. It was the unbothered, deep-seated peace of waking up every morning next to a man who loved me unconditionally, knowing with total certainty that I would never have to deal with their toxic manipulation again. It was the freedom to build to love and to exist entirely on my own terms, completely untethered from their endless demands and cruel expectations. They were trapped in the miserable, desperate lives they had actively chosen to construct, while I was living a life of authentic, hard-earned joy. I took another sip of champagne, turned my face to the sun, and let the sheer, magnificent quiet wash over me. The war was over, and I had won the only prize that actually mattered: peace. Fade to black. The central lesson of this story is that true peace comes from establishing unwavering boundaries and refusing to shrink yourself to accommodate a toxic family. Chloe's journey powerfully demonstrates that sharing DNA does not entitle anyone to exploit your hard-earned success or manipulate your life. The ultimate vindication isn't found in orchestrating public retaliation or watching your abusers fall. Rather, it is found in reclaiming your narrative and building an authentic life entirely free from their chaos. True wealth is the absolute freedom to surround yourself only with those who genuinely love, respect, and uplift you. Share your own experiences of setting firm boundaries with toxic relatives in the comments below, and please hit the like and subscribe buttons for more empowering stories.